This is Hannibal here from the Hannibal TV on YouTube, and today I have one of my favorite personalities in the world of unidentified flying objects. He worked at the UK Ministry of Defense UFO desk from 91 to 94 and was a civil servant for the Ministry of Defense in the UK from 85 to 2006. He's appeared in numerous TV shows, documentaries, consulted on film projects. He's authored books, two of which I've read: The Uninvited and Encounter in Rendlesham Forest. There's also Open Skies, Closed Minds, and science fiction novels that he's done. Nick Pope, how are you doing today, sir?
Great, thank you. It's good to be back.
Great to have you. And I must ask, how's the weather there in Tucson, Arizona? Because it's freezing here in Wichita.
It is very nice. It's well into the 70s, and in fact, we've only got a few more days of 70s before we climb back into the 80s. So it's all good. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I think anyone listening from the UK right now would be upset at you for hearing that as well.
Either that and or kind of trying to work out whether we're doing Fahrenheit or centigrade.
Yes, that's for sure. Me being from Canada, I'm still trying to figure that one out because I know it right now in the UK, it's around 3 degrees, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
pretty awful.
And 70 would be what, 25, 22?
Oh, I'm don't ask me to do math at this.
Exactly. Well, what brought you here from the UK anyways? Was it all related to your UAP work? I know you also married someone from the US, but that's a question a lot of people have.
No, yeah. No, despite all the rumors that I moved here, something to do with the CIA or anything, no, it's completely personal. My wife Elizabeth is a US citizen, and so at the time we met, she was a tenured professor. I was by that time I'd left the Ministry of Defense and was doing freelance, so it was an easy decision that I would move over here to the US.
So, did you get enough time in to officially retire there?
You know what? It's you can go at any time you like. So I had done 21 years, and I just felt that the time had come to seek some fresh challenges. So yeah, there are always all sorts of schemes whereby if you want to take early retirement, you can do so. Obviously, you don't get quite as much pension, but I don't regret a moment of it.
And I had a few questions about your Ministry of Defense work over there. How did the Ministry of Defense in the UK handle public inquiries regarding UFO sightings? And what is the protocol for classifying information as sensitive or not?
Well, the default position with the public is to say as little as possible. And now, when I was doing the job relating to UAP, that was the early 90s. We didn't even have our Freedom of Information Act at that point. So I was quite lucky in a sense. And most contact with the media was through the Defense Press Office. And I, as the subject matter expert on UAP, of course, I wrote all the key messages and defensive lines to take that they would use. So our policy was very much deny, downplay, debunk.
And why does the various governments take that stance overall? I know they have Anna Paulina Luna now working to declassify more information from the US that's previously been classified, but why has this quote unquote cover up been in effect?
Well, I think part of it is just a natural reluctance on the part of government to admit that there might be something in our airspace faster and more maneuverable than our own Air Force jets. No government is particularly comfortable with the implication, frankly, that we've lost control of our skies. So it's far easier just to try and write the whole thing off as swamp gas and weather balloons and nowadays drones and fire lanterns, that sort of thing. So that's part of it. I think the other part is a feeling that if any of this did turn out to be something truly exotic, perhaps extraterrestrial, We would want the technology for ourselves. So in one sense, you want to say as little about this as possible, because we know that various adversaries, whether it's China or Russia, for example, have their own UFO programs, and we wouldn't want them getting ahead of us.
What do you think about this whole declassification group in the US government right now? I understand they're going to work on declassifying some JFK information first for whatever reason before UAP info, but then there's going to be a process where it seems like at the very minimum they're going to want to be able to say we have been visited.
Sure. I mean, President Trump was very clear on this before he took office, and he was asked by people like Joe Rogan, and he gave a commitment to release certainly the rest of the JFK files, but also, yeah, absolutely, to get into UAP. Now, this new task force on the declassification of federal secrets is very interesting because it plays into that, but it goes even wider, because as well as JFK, they're going to look at the assassinations of RFK and MLK. They are going to look at UAP, but also USOs, the unidentified submerged objects. They're going to look at the origins of COVID-19, and they're going to look at the Epstein client list, and they're going to look at some of the 9/11 files. So they have a huge amount of work to do. Now, as you correctly pointed out, the first one that they're going to tackle is JFK. And Anna Paulina Luna, who's chairing this task force, already, of course, in the press release just a couple of weeks ago, announced pretty much that they were inclining towards the view that there were two shooters. And I was watching this, and it was like one of those moments where you say, wait a minute, this is overturning decades of the official narrative. So this is going to be radical.
Now, as a Canadian, I've only just started to look at some of the JFK information. I'm not as interested in it as UAP because I don't think it's going to affect the future of humanity too much. But I'm sure you've done some research into it, and the fans might want to know what's your opinion on the whole JFK issue.
Well, it's not a subject that I've researched in any great depth, but I visited Dealey Plaza, where the assassination took place, of course, a few years ago, and I walked the grounds. And what struck me about it was how much smaller it was than I had expected. And a lot of people say that. So I think if there had been a second shooter on the so-called grassy knoll, and that's the central allegation that's been circulating for years, it's very difficult to see how that second shooter would have not been seen by all sorts of people who were gathering around to watch the motorcade, including a whole bunch of railway workers and construction workers who were basically sitting on and standing on a bridge that went over the road where he was going to drive. So I struggle to kind of process this whole second shooter narrative, but I will see what evidence they present.
And what do you think for the UAP slash USO declassification we're going to see? Do you think we're going to see documents from some of the famous sightings declassified that people really want to know about? Or how much declassification do you think is going to realistically come out?
It's a complicated situation because Congress is already looking at this. And of course, we've had a series of classified briefings, but also there have been two public hearings already in Congress. So there's a danger that this new task force will cut across some of the work that Congress is already doing, both in the Senate and in the House and in various committees, to go through, for example, some of these whistleblowers and to try and find out, what the truth is. But I think there's a very easy solution to a very complicated problem. And it goes back to the idea of the legend of the Gordian knot. from mythology, the knot that nobody could untie, and then Alexander the Great just cut through it. And I think that Gordian knot approach is what we need now to UAP, because in one sense the question is absolutely binary. Either there are or there aren't these legacy intelligence community programs managing crash retrievals and reverse engineering. Either we've got spaceships in hangars and bodies on ice somewhere, or we haven't. So instead of going through all the backstories and all the whistleblowers, they just need to answer that yes, no question. Have we got any of this stuff?
Yeah, because that a lot of people think they already have it anyway, so I don't know if it would make that much of a difference. And I'm sure you've heard about this recent stuff coming out about former Area 51 military employees having weird growths and so forth, which could be related to actual military work on conventional things. But what are your thoughts on all of that's been coming out in the past couple weeks?
Well, I mean, the roots of this go back some way, and of course, there was a lawsuit years ago from workers at Area 51 who claimed that they had health issues associated with that. And for years, the military and the intelligence community blocked this case when people were seriously ill, and that was an absolute scandal. Now, of course, there's the more recent debate that we've been having over things like directed energy weapons, Havana syndrome, things like that. It's very sensitive. Obviously, there are privacy concerns with the legislation, with HIPAA and things like that. But yeah, there does seem to be some evidence. And again, it's probably going to take Congress and or some crusading journalists to try and bring this out of the shadows and put it under the spotlight, because it doesn't matter in one sense whether people have been hurt by working on trying to reverse engineer alien spacecraft or whether they've just been exposed to asbestos. If people have health problems because they were exposed to something as part of their government or military service, then we need answers to that, and those people need to be properly treated, and we need compensation if they've been harmed.
I've heard Elon Musk saying, I don't know if he was joking, that he is renting Area 59 and that there's many areas. And I think he claimed he'd been to Area 51, but there wasn't much going on there anymore compared to previous years. Do you think now that everyone knows about Area 51, of course, it's still impenetrable for like your average person to actually get close. But do you think that they've moved some of the more secretive things to other areas around the U.S. for testing?
I'm sure they have. The moment something becomes so embedded in the pop culture as Area 51 has, even if, as you say correctly, it's still off limits to the public, Congress are probably poking around trying to find out what's going on. So, yeah, the smart money is on the fact that anything there has been moved somewhere else, or certainly if there's anything extraterrestrial, maybe move it even offshore somewhere. I mean, people talk about Diego Garcia in the Pacific as being a remote area where there's a US base, or actually it's quite complicated in terms of the ownership. But yeah, it's probably maybe somewhere like that, or somewhere that folks just haven't heard of.
Yeah, and there's a base in Guam as well that you hear that there's a lot of UAP activity over that could be testing, I guess.
Yeah, and you hear a lot about Catalina Island. I know that's closer
Yeah.
to home, but again, gives you the opportunity of doing something off the west coast of the US. And if you do anything overseas, it's much less likely to be seen. I mean, obviously, it's got to take off from somewhere, but if you fly at night and then test things over the sea, you can get away with an awful lot, even pretty close to the continental United States.
I only watched UFOs Past, Present, and Future recently, which is a documentary that allegedly originally was going to be put out to declassify UFO information, and they did. It's actually weird going back and watching it, how much information they let out from that in the 70s. But I guess the folklore is that originally they were actually going to show a UFO landing at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, and supposedly, and some military people have not confirmed nor denied this, that at one point there was a UFO that supposedly landed there, and there may have been a face-to-face meeting. Do you know anything about this, and what did you think about that movie?
It's certainly part of the UFO lore that this was a plan. And I've heard different versions of the story, but I've heard that obviously Disney were put up to do this because everyone trusts Disney, and people were talking about, let's get Walter Cronkite to be the voice of it because he was the voice of America. And so the plan, according to this theory, was that this was the way to get this out slowly to the public as part of an acclimatization program, that you drip feed this information out bit by bit, and that this wasn't quite official disclosure with the president saying, my fellow Americans, people of the world, we're not alone, but it's maybe a stepping stone on the way to that. If you can get Disney and Walter Cronkite and eventually put something at Epcot, for example. I've heard those stories. I can't validate all of it, but there's a certain logic that you would want to do it bit by bit, not all at once, particularly if there is part of this which is unsettling for people for whatever reason.
Do you think that there have been face-to-face meetings? Because I heard Jim Semivan from To the Stars Academy, who had a long career in the CIA as an operative, say recently that he does actually believe that. That would be his hypothesis, that at some point there have been face-to-face meetings and agreements made.
I don't rule it out. And again, there's a certain logic about that. If you're dealing civilization to civilization, even though clearly any visiting extraterrestrials are orders of magnitude ahead of ourselves. That said, if you wanted, for example, as many allege, to effectively allow cattle mutilations to happen, abductions to happen, and of course there would be a quid pro quo, and many believe that the quid pro quo was us acquiring technologies which enabled the United States to win the Cold War, whether that's night vision goggles, Kevlar, stealth, fiber optics, if you go back a bit further, the transistor, and all of that. So yeah, it would make sense that if there has been a protracted program involving visitation and interaction, that at some stage part of that would be a top level meeting where the parameters of this relationship are effectively negotiated out between the two parties, us and them.
And you do point this out, and it's kind of depressing in your UFO book, where you bring up all of the animal testing that we do that people really don't know about or choose not to really research or think about, for the people that say, why would we allow UAPs to do such things? But it's no different than a lot of the stuff that we do to animals.
Absolutely. And we do it sometimes for the most mundane and petty of reasons. I mean, putting chemicals in the eyes of rabbits just to develop a different form of cosmetics. I mean, you can understand, and I know things have changed somewhat, but you can understand, for example, testing on animals if there was a very realistic probability, for example, of developing new medicines that will cure human diseases and things. But if it's just for things like cosmetics or new coloring agents for food, I mean, it's a kind of skewed moral compass for us to sort of say, well, aliens would be doing a terrible thing by abducting people and experimenting, when we do exactly the same on life that we regard as more primitive than ourselves.
There's a fan on here, and you kind of addressed this in our last interview, but have the drones and UAP sightings stopped in New Jersey? Was it just hysteria? You have any update for us?
Well, it hasn't stopped. And I don't rule out that hysteria was part of this. I mean, clearly it was. I mean, I literally saw people posting on social media what was clearly images of aircraft lights and helicopter lights and things. But that doesn't negate the fact that other people were and still are seeing things that they regard as anomalous. But the news cycle moves on, and we're now just on other stories. A lot of water has gone under the bridge, and for whatever reason, but that's part of it, the media has taken its eye off that particular ball. But the people in New Jersey are still experiencing some of those things. And if you follow along on X and other social media platforms, you'll see from time to time people still posting footage, and people in the local community, the local area, still commenting on it and saying, hey, we're still seeing these things. So no, it's not stopped, and we don't have resolution.
You get sent a lot of UFO videos, and there's some people even in the comments here saying they've sent you things and you've commented on it. How do you differentiate now in 2025? What's a drone when drones can be so advanced? What's CGI? What's a real thing? When it gets so complicated these days, it's not just like people can string up little diagrams of UFOs now to fake pictures and videos.
Yes, I must be showing my age, because you're right. Back when I was doing this for the government, really the only ways to fake these sorts of photos was either literally to throw something in the air and then get the photo, or suspend it from a tree by a piece of fishing line or something like that, or do a double exposure. But nowadays, I mean, the short answer to your question is you can't really differentiate, because AI in particular is getting so sophisticated that it is creating some scarily realistic still images and video images, which are really indistinguishable from reality. Now, of course, there are all sorts of computer programs trying to keep up with this that will tell you they can figure out whether it's AI or not, whether AI has been used at any point to either create or enhance an image. But I bet that it's like missiles and anti-missiles. As soon as you develop that, you probably get the AI program that can disguise the fact that it's used AI and kind of cheat the system. So yeah, like I say, when people send me things, with the best will in the world, now that I have left the Ministry of Defense, I don't have access to intelligence community imagery analysis resources and capabilities. That frankly, as well as maybe cutting edge commercial programs that folks like Elon Musk have with Grok and the Chat GPT folks. Aside from that sort of thing, it's very difficult if you're just looking at things on your laptop, like I am now, to tell what's real and what's not.
Yeah, and some of the even with the drone footage where it showed some of these supposed drones getting shot down, I found that hard to believe, and I think that turned a lot of people off of the drones because it just seems too fake. That if we actually saw drone battles in the air, there would be way more people getting it from various angles than just one angle. So I don't know. To me, it turns me off of UFO videos a little bit. That type of stuff.
And maybe that's the point. Maybe there are people in the intelligence community putting this sort of stuff out for precisely that reason, because they know that a lot of folks like you will just roll their eyes and say, oh, that's obviously a fake. And then you end up throwing out the baby with the bathwater. The other issue is that, of course, at any point in time, there will be drones, military drones, way more advanced than anything that you'll actually see in the media for example. And I know there are a few demo videos out there that if people search on terms like drone swarms AI mean, this is the future of military warfare. We've seen the low tech version, and even that, I say low tech, you can still destroy a multi-million-dollar tank just by dropping a grenade down the hatch from a hobbyist drone. But there's stuff out there way more advanced than that.
Very interesting. I heard you on the Basement Office show you used to do, and it's been a few years now, talking about the various types of common craft, and you were saying it went to the saucer, to the triangle. Now in 2025, it seems more like these egg shapes slash tic tac shapes are more commonly seen. Am I correct in that, or what would you say is the most commonly seen UAP these days?
Well, it's a difficult question because with all of this, sometimes the media kind of almost self-select. So you if there's a dominant narrative, and that narrative is that a lot of these things are oval or tic-tac shape, then if the media are aware of a whole bunch of different reports with different shapes, they're still more likely to run the story with the shape that conforms to their expectation. So there's a kind of confound with that. That being said, if you go on to the website of the Pentagon's All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office and look at what they're posting, according to Arrow, one of the most commonly reported shapes at the moment is a sphere. And of course, this brings back the whole debate about orbs. And we're hearing a lot more again about orbs recently. But that's from the Pentagon itself. So that's still out there as a common shape.
What do you know about orbs? Because we see these orbs in those New Jersey drone videos and other videos. Then we hear about the ghost type of orbs. Then in Lou Elizondo's Eminent book, which I'm sure you've read or heard about, he claims there was orbs following him around in his house at various points. For some reason, he never wanted to set up cameras because it was infrequent, I guess. But like it seems like there's various types of orbs, and some of them can actually cause medical harm to people allegedly, and others are more benign.
Yes, and again with these orbs, it ties in. We don't know what they are, therefore we don't know are they a device of some sort? In which case, do they have a energy source, propulsion system? Is some of that responsible for the so-called UAP radiation that you'll read about in some government UAP documents? But then you get, and I think you hit the nail on the head, you get this kind of crossover with the orbs between UAP and more traditional paranormal phenomena. I mean, you could make an argument that UAP isn't paranormal at all, even if you think it's extraterrestrial. In that hypothesis, the UAP is just a craft; it's just a means of transport. Well, orbs takes you into the kind of blurry line between that and paranormal phenomena. And some people will tell you that some of these orbs are interactive. And I've heard suggestion even that some of them are sentient, a sort of plasmoid life form, perhaps. I mean, it sounds extreme, but you will see some government documents talking about exotic plasma phenomena. And then you get some writers going back as far as the 50s and 60s. And I'm talking about writers who people probably not familiar with these days, but like Trevor James Constable and Wilhelm Reich, talking about orgone energy, talking about sky critters. So there's a lot for people to process here.
As far as these craft, I know you've said some of them you can see beings or shapes of people in. What percentage is that where you could actually see something like windows where something might be able to be seen moving around in these things?
I would say it's very small for two reasons, I think. Firstly, well, three reasons. Number one, a lot of this is seen at night, and it's pretty difficult in many occasions to figure out more than just bright lights. Second, a lot of these things are quite small. When we talk about orbs and when we talk about these spheres, we're generally talking about things which are quite small. And the other point, even with large saucer shaped or triangular shaped UAP, and triangular shaped UAP were certainly, that was the dominant narrative, certainly in the late 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. Generally speaking, of course, a lot of the people who get really good views of this are looking at these things from underneath. And so the windows would be on the side, I guess, or at the front. So again, you've seen these sometimes photos, but more often than not, drawings of people who are drawing triangles, but their viewing point is directly underneath the thing. So you see the lights in each corner and a fainter light in the middle on the underside, which some people think is an engine of some sort. But yeah, so again, to answer the question in percentage terms, I would say way less than 5%, but maybe less than 1%.
Now, I've never seen any orbs, so I couldn't tell you anything, but there's Danielle on here says she's seen them and they don't seem to show up when the moon is visible. Have you heard anything about this from other reports?
No, I haven't, but without wanting to be sarcastic about it, but I mean, it's a point of just, I guess, sort of optics and things on the night of a full moon or a night of a very bright moon. Just the ambient light is such that other things are more difficult to make out. I mean, if you are an astronomer, for example, your best viewing conditions are basically when there's no moon. So a full moon, people kind of in the cities maybe don't appreciate that, but where we are, for example, in the desert in Arizona, on a night of a full moon, it puts out a lot of light. And so if there are things like orbs around, you're just much less likely to see them because of the light from the moon. So it's not necessarily kind of anything spooky about that.
What could you tell us about these crafts the size of football fields that are occasionally reported by some credible people? And I've heard you speak about this before.
Yes, I mean, we had, of course, the Phoenix Lights, and that's maybe from 1997. That's maybe the best known such case in recent years, but we had a little before that in the 80s, the Hudson Valley wave, and again, there were huge craft seen there. And we had a wave of sightings in the UK as well. And I have literally seen these referred to as flying football fields, just because when you ask people how big these things were, they kind of go all kind of ashen faced and say, almost like they're still in shock remembering it. This thing was the size of a football field, which the human mind almost can't process something like that, particularly if it's just hanging there in the skies with no obvious sort of engines, fuselage, wings, tail, anything like that, hanging there in the skies and then accelerating off at high speed. We don't know what these things are. If we've got one in a hangar somewhere, I hope we'll see it. And of course, investigative journalist Ross Coulthart has talked about how one of his sources has discussed a UFO so big that it couldn't be moved, and they built a facility around it and or buried it. So there's a lot of talk about this sort of thing, but we still need that smoking gun.
Do you think, like with the case of that one, the size of the football field, that they had to build a facility around instead of moving it, that would have been one of the things the ships left intentionally? Because we do hear that one of the theories is some of them might be crashed, but a lot of the times they might be leaving these things intentionally for us for whatever reason.
Well, this is very interesting, and it goes back to the testimony that David Grush has given. And part of that testimony he's given under oath to Congress, and part of it he's given in a small number of interviews. But obviously, he has to be extremely careful about what he's said. And absolutely, he has discussed how some of these things were intact. And then somebody said, well, how can they be intact if they crashed? And the response is they didn't crash. They were just left here. I don't like to use the phrase gifts from the gods, because that conjures up all sorts of kind of ideas that maybe I don't necessarily hold with, but I've heard the phrase used. And again, if a technology, if an advanced technology is being given to us, the question then becomes, well, firstly, where is it? But secondly, why? And the old phrase, I suppose, you shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth. It does make you wonder. I've heard, and this is another thought, we've heard about these egg-shaped craft. And that set me thinking, well, what is an egg but a receptacle for new life? Maybe these things aren't what we think they are. And maybe they're not gifts in the sense that we think they are. Maybe, when somebody does something, you've got to ask yourself, is it truly altruistic? Or if you look at the human experience, is there an alternative motive? Are you expecting to get a quid pro quo? And if so, what is that quid pro quo? So I think if we think of these things as gifts from the gods, that's not a healthy way of thinking. I would be thinking, is this a Trojan horse?
Yes, very good point there. I was wondering that myself. As far as what these alleged beings look like and where, I mean, we talked before about what they look like, but I've been talking to various people, some more credible than others, alleged abductees, and there seems to be quite a variety of clothes, from naked to very skin tightish clothes to cloaks. What do you think are the most credible uh, evidence of what these things wear? Because it seems like the Greys don't wear anything for the most part.
If we are dealing with biological life forms here, I would think, unless you have a sort of very big coincidence that their home world happens to be a very similar mix of nitrogen and oxygen mainly, but also carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and unless their atmosphere was almost exactly the same as ours, and gravity too, you would think that they would need spacesuits of some sort. So I would look for evidence of a spacesuit. I think cloaks and things. It's all very dramatic, but not very practical. That being said, if, as many allege, these are not necessarily biological life forms in the sense that we would think, but if they are humanoid robots of some sort, or just something that's been grown by extraterrestrial AI just to make it mobile, then maybe they wouldn't need a spacesuit. So I don't know. You can argue round in circles on this, and another potential confound is the fact that any civilization capable of viable interstellar travel can probably scramble people's memories a little bit, and leave people with a false impression of what the beings looked like, what they were wearing, what they did, what they said. So again, I look for deception throughout all of this, and I think I'm not talking about deception from the abductees, though clearly not everyone is telling the truth. But I'm talking about deception from the phenomenon. Are people really seeing and experiencing what they think they are seeing and experiencing, even if they're entirely sincere when they tell the media or tell UFO researchers about this?
Yeah, because isn't it Jacques Vallée's Passport to Mongolia book where it shows the ET with various masks on, like the devil and Christ and all that? Like they can make themselves appear like covert, whatever they want to be. Not saying that they're 100% God or anything, but they could make themselves appear like a god if they wanted to, in theory.
Yes. Arthur C. Clarke famously said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and therefore it follows that any sufficiently advanced intelligence would be indistinguishable from God. And so, yes, these things could appear to us as aliens, angels, gods, devils, demons, monsters. The real form of these things may be the image that you didn't see on the front of Jacques Vallée's book. All these other images, as you say, are just masks that this wears. But what this is unknown and perhaps forever unknowable to us at the current state of human development, intellectual and conceptual. I mean.
Yeah, and another thing, I've just watched this interview with Jim Semivan, and he doesn't do a lot, but one thing he was talking about in this as well was he believes it's the phenomenon saying that they don't want to be revealed. What do you think about that comment?
There is a lot of logic about that comment because people often say, and of course, this debate is playing out right now. Who's going to disclose? Is President Trump going to disclose? Is another nation going to disclose? And as I pointed out the other day, and this I think is exactly the same point that Jim was making, the phenomenon itself gets a say in this. And if the phenomenon is more advanced than us, which seems to be the case, not only does the phenomenon get a say, the phenomenon gets the deciding vote.
Yeah, and you were also saying it, and I think it was your abduction book, that it's hard to really even explain this, but we might just not be able to comprehend the whole situation at this point. Just like I think you used the term moths might not be able to comprehend what humanity is. We just really might not be able to understand what this is at our stage of development as far as the whole phenomena.
Yes, the analogy. I'll come on to the moths in a minute. The shorthand version of this is that there might be things that we can't understand, just as a chimpanzee couldn't understand quantum physics. The moth analogy was made many years ago by a British writer called John Spencer, and he said, imagine, if you were a moth and you live in a colony of moths and a big interstate runs through that colony, and one day you're just flying around and you get sucked in to a passing car through the open window, and there are entities in there, i.e. humans, and they flap around a bit and eventually get you back out of the window a few miles down the road, and you go back to your colony of moths and you say, look, you're never going to believe what was happening. To me, I got taken on board this craft. There were these strange entities. I saw strange dials and levers and controls, and then they just let me go. And the other moths will go, you're crazy. So that's maybe a nice analogy to have in mind when you think about those sorts of things.
100%. And you're mentioning about what mind control devices they have or what weapons they might have. What do you know about the 1976 Tehran Iran incident where supposedly they may have tried to chase a UFO, the Iranian military, and it didn't work out too well for them?
Oh, I know, or I knew he died a few years ago, but I met, I think on a couple of occasions, but at least one, uh, Parviz Jafari, who actually retired as a general. Now, of course, people forget, but the Iran under the Shah used to be an ally of the United States, and so the US supplied a lot of military hardware and training. And so that's why we knew about that case. And yeah, as you say, in 1976, a UFO was seen in restricted military airspace fairly close to Tehran. Two jets, I believe, were scrambled and ordered to intercept this object. And Parviz Jafari was ordered to open fire with an air-to-air missile, and he actually reached for his control, and as he tells the story, at that point the missile panel kind of went dead, and it's like his everything else in the aircraft worked, but the weapons system, as he put it, was taken offline, and he lost the ability to launch air to air. Now, we only know about this case because under the Freedom of Information Act, a copy turned up some years later in, I think, somebody had sent the US contingent, military contingent in Iran, had sent a report to various US military and intelligence agencies. And I think someone had got it. So maybe somebody had forgotten to redact it or remove it from the file, but it turned up, I think, in a DOD or maybe Defense Intelligence Agency in the response to an FOI request. So, and then once that got out there, eventually General Parviz Jafari, I think, left Iran, and I think he moved to Canada, actually. Um, and he gave a couple of interviews, but I met him a few years ago, and he obviously, as I say, retired as a general. And to hear it from him directly like that was powerful testimony for sure.
Now, I have got into your Rendlesham Forest UAP book, and I'm not going to delve into it too much this time. I will next time we have you back. But as one thing that really has stood out to me so far is where the one military personnel touched the alleged UAP, the triangular UAP, and a binary code kind of like downloaded into his brain, which he wrote down, and it later got translated, I believe, a couple decades later. Could you try and explain that part to us? Because it's a little, I didn't even know what a binary code was until I first heard this. But the more I've researched this, the more fascinated I've been of this aspect of the story.
Sure, the witness was Jim Peniston, who got closest to this craft and, as you say, touched the side of it on the first night. Now, he got a kind of almost like electric shock or jolt of some sort. And a few days later, as if he was under some sort of compulsion or in a trance of some sort, back when he was sitting at home, he wrote down in a notebook a series of ones and zeros, and he had no idea what it was, and he put it away, and he didn't think any more about it for about 30 years, something like that. And 30 years later, because he also had a sketch of the UFO in his notebook, somebody on the set of a TV show was looking over his shoulder. I say somebody, I think it was Linda Moulton Howe, actually, and said to Jim, seeing all these ones and zeros, what the heck's that? And Jim was very embarrassed because he'd never talked about that. That's how the story came out. So what they did is they gave those ones and zeros to a computer engineer called Nick Sisk. And Nick said, well, this is binary code, right? So I'll just decode it, because you can, if you write something in English, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog, and then translate it into binary, you'll get 100101110, whatever it is. And so you can translate things back and forward. Binary is just the language, computer language. So the translation of these 16 pages worked out to be continuous exploration for planetary advance, eyes of your eyes, origin year 8100, and then some geographical coordinates, which happened when somebody checked, matched up with, for example, the Great Pyramids at Giza, the Nazca lines in Peru, Sedona in Arizona, all sorts of ancient sacred sites. So it's a very mysterious part of the whole Rendlesham story, for sure.
And didn't he offer to have his book um, scientifically examined to see when he wrote that code as well at one point?
Yes, because a lot of people just didn't believe him. He said, "Well, we can test this, surely." I mean, Jim is a retired military cop, so Jim was very familiar with forensics. And so Jim's point was, hey, if you don't believe me, forensicate the notebook, because you'll be able to tell, the type of notebook, the type of paper, the ink. So it's an open offer from Jim. I think once he'd called people's bluff, I don't think anyone has actually done it, but he was very clear from day one. He said, if you don't believe me, I'm very happy for any reputable scientific laboratory to take this and do some tests, which is not what a liar would say. A liar would say, oh no, this is sentimental value, I don't want to part with it. What if it gets lost or destroyed? No, Jim was like, yeah, bring it on.
Yeah, and now it'd probably also be worth a fortune to a collector as well. But as far as what binary code is and how long it's existed for, because this is the first time I've ever heard of it. But I saw in an interview you did on Basement Office, you also talked about some super genius who probably would never have heard about this, also theorized that if aliens ever wanted to connect with us, they would do it through binary code.
Ah, yes, that's Professor Ronald Mallet. He's one of the few theoretical physicists researching and investigating time travel. I mean, obviously, Stephen Hawking wrote about the possibility of it, not least in his classic book, A Brief History of Time. But Professor Ronald Mallet is one of the few people now looking at that. Stephen Hawking, of course, died some years ago. And Professor Mallet theorized that if you wanted to send a message back through time, what you would do is you would use subatomic particles and then now this is way beyond my simple brain, I'm afraid, but some subatomic particles have a so-called spin state, which can either be up or down. And so Professor Mallet said, well, if you could control the spin state of these particles to be either up or down, then what you could do is if you then incorporate that into some means of sending it back in time, you could send not just an object, you could send a message. And of course, many people who look at Rendlesham say that's exactly what Jim Penniston received. So when I find these kind of connections between ufology and theoretical physics, it gets my attention.
To me, that might be the best evidence that's been released to the public of documented communication related to UAPs, unless there's something else you've heard of.
Well, all sorts of people claim to have been given messages, but the problem is, and when I say people, I'm talking about the contactees. So even before the abductees, the contactees going back to the 1950s, unfortunately, a lot of the so-called messages that they came back with just sounded like almost like new age buzzword bingo. Frankly, it was all, we're for the benefit, we're here for the benefit of humanity. We're here to warn you about the dangers of polluting your environment and the dangers of nuclear war. I mean, those may be very real dangers, but it didn't really tell us anything that we didn't already know. Of course, we shouldn't be having a nuclear war. Of course, we shouldn't be polluting our environment to the extent that we destroy the ecosystem and species go extinct. We know that. We don't need aliens to tell us that. So yeah, what I want is a smoking gun. I want a message through time or through time and space that tells us, for example, the solution to an unsolved mathematical problem. Because that way, and you can go on to the internet, and if people search on phrases like major unsolved problems in maths or theoretical physics or computer science, there's a whole bunch of them. Some of them have $1 million X prizes associated with them. Well, that wouldn't, my question to all the people saying that they've got communication from aliens is, if you've really got genuine communication, get the solution to one of those problems. Firstly, you'll get the attention of even the most diehard skeptic. And secondly, you'll probably pick up $1 million in the process.
100%. But I mean, as far as getting a code that this person likely would have had no way of knowing about, that these type of codes even existed, and then not talking about it for 30 years, and then the contents of the code coming out sounding like something that we might be told. I mean, that seems better than just kids being told something at a school about the environment. To
Exactly.
me, yeah.
I mean, if this was a hoax, you would tell that story straight away. You wouldn't wait 30 years. And even if you did, for some reason, you would try and sell the story. Well, that's not what he did at all. If anything, he's just given it all away.
Yeah, and last question here for today. Just very briefly, why do you think UFO waves occur, like the one we had in Belgium, or some people may even have called that New Jersey thing back in December a wave?
It's difficult to say whether this is because the media is just reporting it more, or whether there are genuinely more sightings. But for whatever reason, you're right. There are these waves. There are times and places where you get a lot of sightings, and then it goes quiet. And so my question is always, when are we going to see the next wave? And what's that going to reveal?
Yeah, because that one for a year in Belgium, for example, 89, 90, if that would happen today with camera phones, there would be some unquestionable evidence. But maybe they know about this now, and that's why they're not revealing themselves, just like the Phoenix lights that you had there in Arizona, which I guess you weren't in Arizona at that point.
I wasn't, sad to say, but yeah, something on that scale now, and the world would know in minutes.
So you are on Amazon if people want to download your books, Audible, where I've been getting your audio books, which are great. Where else can people follow you?
My website is nickpope.net, and the social media platform that I use most often is X, formerly Twitter, and I am at Nick Pope MOD.
Very good. And if you could close this off with just shutting it down, but telling us what you think we could expect in the next month or so in the UFO world.
I think we're going to see a ramping up of the work of the task force on the declassification of federal secrets. Their hearings on JFK are going to be March, but I hope they get to UAP as the next one after that. So watch Congress and watch this new task force.